missed your meeting yesterday. Sorry about that. We prepared a lot of important
You didn't speak.
No. We saw the China web. Oh. You see, I asked you swap the speaker. This place such others. Very disappointing. It's not a good meeting. No, we are talking about the membership.
The 9,596th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Australia, Israel, Poland, and Saudi Arabia to participate in this meeting. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Mr. Ramesh Ransingham, I'm sorry if I mispronounced, Director of Coordination, United Nations Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and Ms. Janti Seripto, President and Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children. It's so decided. All right. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Agenda Item 2. I give the floor to Mr. Ransingham.
Thank you, Madam President. On Sunday, it will be 6 months since the outbreak of this horrific chapter in the conflict in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. 6 months of heartache and grief for the families and friends of those killed and taken hostage in the grisly attacks of 7 October. And 6 months of unfathomable death, destruction, deprivation, trauma, and suffering for the people of Gaza. 6 months that calls our collective humanity and priorities into question. In Gaza, according to the Ministry of Health, more than 32,000 people have been killed and more than 75,000 have been injured. At least 2/3 of these casualties are women and children. And thousands more are missing, many of them buried beneath the rubble. And 17,000 children are now unaccompanied or separated from their parents or families, alone amidst the destruction and horror. 1.7 million people, or 75% of the population, have been forcibly displaced. For many of them, time and time again, forced into tents, overcrowded shelters, or even on the streets, lacking the most basic necessities for dignified life and survival. Some 60% of housing has now been damaged or destroyed. So it's clear there is no protection of civilians in Gaza. And if they have no protection from the dangers of armed conflict there, they must be allowed to seek it elsewhere. Some Palestinians in Gaza have already left through Egypt, and we know more are trying. It is vital to recall that any persons displaced from Gaza must be guaranteed the right to voluntary return as international law demands. Madam President, I come now to the events of last week, which laid bare with clear evidence the unconscionable brutality of this conflict. Intense Israeli bombardment and ground operations, as well as heavy fighting between Israeli forces and Palestinian armed groups, have continued across much of the Gaza Strip, causing hundreds more dead and injured. The prospect of a military operation on Rafah continues. As we all know, the consequences would be incomprehensible. On 1 April, the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the besieged Al-Shifa medical complex in Gaza City revealed a hospital and many buildings in the surrounding residential area almost entirely destroyed. The UN and partners only reached the facility today after repeated requests were denied to help triage remaining patients and assess needs on the ground. Al-Shifa was the largest hospital in Gaza, formerly serving more than 250,000 people. The loss to a health system already in tatters amid skyrocketing health needs is incalculable. And then on the same day, we saw 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers killed in multiple Israeli airstrikes on their convoy. These workers had just unloaded more than 100 tons of much-needed life-saving humanitarian supplies from the second World Central Kitchen maritime aid shipment to a warehouse in Deir al-Balah. They had informed the Israeli army of their movements. We extend our deepest condolences to the families and friends of these courageous, selfless people who were there to help their fellow human beings in their time of need. Sadly, we cannot say that this tragic attack was an isolated incident in this conflict. They joined more than 220 of our humanitarian colleagues who have been killed, 179 of them UN personnel, including many along with their families. I echo the Secretary General's deep concern about clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing. Allegations of serious violations must be investigated and suspects prosecuted. And all member states can and must use their leverage to prevent and stop violations of international humanitarian law through diplomatic and economic pressure, conditioning arms exports and compliance with the rules of war, and cooperation in combating impunity. Madam President, the incident on 1 April was not just a tragedy for the World Central Kitchen aid workers that were killed and their family and friends. It was also a tragedy for the people of Gaza. The undeniable lack of protection for aid missions has forced the World Central Kitchen and at least one other aid organization, the NGO ANERA, to suspend their operations. Both organizations provide hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza with food each week. It is unclear when their work will resume. So this comes amidst an unprecedented food insecurity crisis in Gaza that is teetering on the edge of famine if it hasn't already fallen into it. Across Gaza, food and safe water are increasingly scarce, and practically the entire population of Gaza is relying on woefully inadequate food assistance to survive. Diseases are rife, contributing to a surge in acute malnutrition, particularly among women and children. In northern Gaza, UNICEF reports that 1 in 6 children are acutely malnourished, with an estimated 3% facing the most severe forms of wasting, requiring immediate treatment. At least 31 people, including 28 children, are believed to have starved to death in recent weeks. It's a situation that requires concerted action right now. Waiting for a retrospective famine classification is entirely indefensible. Madam President, despite the dangers, aid workers continue efforts to deliver assistance to people across Gaza through all available means. This includes the distribution of food, water, medical items, non-food items, fuel, and medical evacuations. Last week, the UN and its partners reached a daily average of 550,000 people with food assistance, although we were only able to get 4% of this to Gaza City and northern Gaza. UNRWA continues to run 7 healthcare centers, which provide 23,000 consultations every day and have administered 53,000 vaccines since the start of the war. But it cannot be repeated enough that the scale and extent of the assistance we are able to get to people in Gaza is wholly insufficient. The primary obstacle, however aid is brought in, is our ability to distribute it within Gaza, particularly to the north. And a serious limiting factor is that UNRWA, the backbone of the humanitarian response, has not been allowed to operate in the north of Gaza. If we are to stave off famine and address the unconscionably catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, UNRWA, and indeed all impartial humanitarian organizations, must have safe, rapid, unimpeded access to all civilians in need. There is simply no replacement for the services that UNRWA provides. Madam President, one of the cruel tragedies of Sunday's unwanted milestone is that it does not mark an end to the death, destruction, and human suffering for the past 6 months. It does not bring an end to the ordeal of those still held hostage and the torment for their families. And this is despite clear obligations under international humanitarian law, and despite the provisional order of the International Court of Justice requiring Israel to take all necessary and effective measures to ensure, without delay, the unhindered provision at scale of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. And despite this Council recognizing the need to expand the flow of aid into Gaza and within Gaza, and despite this Council's resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, this tragedy cannot be allowed to continue. All hostages must be immediately released and treated humanely until they are. And likewise, the people of Gaza need full compliance with international humanitarian law and with the ICJ's orders. They need compliance with the decisions of this Council, and they need most of all this devastating war to end. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Rajasingham, sorry, for his briefing. I give the floor to Mr. Ripto.
Madam Members of the UN Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to address you about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. As we sit here today, and as you've just heard, over 220 humanitarian workers have been killed in Gaza, the highest number of humanitarian casualties in modern times. First and foremost, I would like to pay tribute to those humanitarians who have lost their lives in this conflict, who were killed in this conflict. Nearly all have been Palestinians. They were killed serving their communities in perhaps the worst conditions of their lives and of their careers. Day in, day out, they worked tirelessly to save lives, to feed the hungry, to provide medical care to the sick and wounded, to provide shelter, to protect. They were professionals, conducting this response to the standards of the humanitarian principles that guide our global sector. They upheld their ethical end of the bargain. The parties to this conflict, including members represented in this Security Council body, have not. One of my own colleagues, Sameh Ewaida, was killed in an Israeli airstrike on the 12th of December, along with his entire family. This strike came days after a ceasefire resolution was vetoed in this room. Sameh and his wife, Fatima, were the proud parents of 4 children, Mohammed, age 12, Heba, age 11, Zaina, age 3, and Zain, age 2. They died together, buried under 4 floors of rubble. Children, like Sameh's, bear the brunt of conflict. Save the Children's founder said it best over 100 years ago. Every war is a war against the child. This is sadly still true today, especially in Gaza. In this conflict, 14,000 children have been violently killed. Thousands more are missing, presumed buried under the rubble. If I were to sit here and read the name and age of every Israeli and Palestinian child who died on and after October 7th, it would take me over 18 hours. More children have been killed in this conflict than have been killed in all armed conflicts globally every year over the past 4 years. And children are not small adults. They have a special status in conflict, specific vulnerabilities and an additional set of rights afforded to them and distinct obligations owed to them. They must be protected. Yet, children have been taken hostage. Thousands of children have been maimed, their limbs ripped from them by explosive weapons, mutilated by bullets, burned, crushed, or struck down by preventable disease. Inevitably, after months of systemic and deliberate denial of humanitarian access, children are now dying from malnutrition and dehydration in Gaza. Denied food and water by an illegal blockade, they have been starved to death. The first thing that struck me when I arrived in Gaza last week was how many children there were, how many of them were actually running around without shoes, over glass and rubble and debris, running around desperately looking for food and water because not enough is being allowed into Gaza. They were visibly, demonstrably malnourished. 350,000 children under the age of 5 are at risk of starvation as we speak. The world is staring down the barrel of a man-made famine. The hunger in the north is of a particular concern, where people have now resulted to eat animal feed or tree leaves. If we continue down this path of all parties to conflict, flagrantly breaching the rule of war and international humanitarian law, zero accountability, powerful nations refusing to use the levers of influence at their disposal, then the next set of mass deaths of children in Gaza will not be from bullets and bombs. It will be from starvation and malnutrition. This indecision and inaction is a choice, and choices have consequences. Severe malnutrition is not a quiet or painless death. As children get hungry, their bodies weaken, their muscles waste, Their vision blurs, immune systems fail, organs fail, hearts stop. At this stage, children are too weak to cry. While I was in Gaza, I visited some really excellent humanitarian programs staffed by incredible people, my own colleagues and many others. I saw a field hospital erected in 14 days, using only locally available materials because the other materials were not allowed in. These heroic efforts are fighting against an overwhelming tide of need. There is no sanitation to speak of. A community I visited had one toilet for 600 people. Women stood in line for 3 hours to make use of it. Schools normally form a spine of protection for children, a place where children can seek humanitarian services and normality. Go ahead. Education is...
Wow. That's great.
Is that an earthquake?
Yeah.
Oh, education is...
You're making the ground shake.
Education is in many ways... Madam President, am I okay to continue? Education is in many ways life-saving, but not in Gaza, where every single child is out of school and 80% of education facilities have been destroyed. Our teams have found that almost every piece of educational equipment in Gaza, chairs, desks, textbooks, have been destroyed or burned by desperate people trying to stay warm. And we're not mentioning even mental health and psychosocial support, the traumas these children and families are experiencing, the horrors they continue to live through. Not one child should be exposed to such death and violence. One mother in that community I visited told me she needed mental health support more than food, which in the context of a famine, of a looming famine, is an interesting comment. Despite the dangers of every day, humanitarians return to work because we believe civilians in conflict have a right to access life-sustaining basics, even when they do not have access to peace and security. And as a global community, we have agreed to international humanitarian laws designed to make this world possible, effective, and as safe as can be expected. But this is not the case today in Gaza. Nowhere is safe, no one is safe. We are hearing world leaders emphasize the importance of access, calls for deconfliction, protection of civilians, speedy investigations, and lessons learned, upholding of humanitarian law, and so on. This discourse creates the false impression that the humanitarian system in Gaza is being prioritized. It is not. Words belie the inaction. Aid organizations need you to hear this. Stop pretending that protection of civilians is prioritized here. We are overwhelmed with impediments. Human life is not being prioritized, not the lives of civilians, of children, and certainly not the lives of humanitarians. An investigation is not enough. We need action, we need change, and we need it now. Give humanitarians safe access and a ceasefire, and we can save lives. We know how to stabilize children dying from malnutrition. We know how to treat diarrheal disease. These fatal threats to young children, we address them all over the world, and we have done so for a century. It is not rocket science, actually. It is delicate, but it is straightforward. We know how to do it. We share our coordinates with COGAT and the Israeli military. We do this for every single movement, for every single one of our locations and distribution centers. And we don't get on the road if we do not have confirmation that they have been received and that our movement is deconflicted. What is so unsettling about the deaths of our colleagues from World Central Kitchen last week is that they did everything they were supposed to do, and they were still killed. What do we need from this Council? And it is not new news. We call on this Council to pass a permanent ceasefire resolution, including robust measures to ensure compliance by parties to the conflict to enforce a ceasefire and resolutions already passed. Member States must stop fueling this crisis with weapons they're selling to the parties of the conflict. And while the opening of Erez yesterday is welcome and long overdue, all crossing points must be opened. We need to flood Gaza with food, water, and aid to prevent further tragedy. We need unfettered humanitarian access in all of Gaza. More aid must be allowed to come in. Commercial trade must resume because markets need to function again. And we must have a plan to finance and rebuild critical infrastructure, such as hospitals, schools, water systems, and homes. I know resolutions passed in this room do not immediately lead to change behavior on the ground. I saw that very vividly myself last week. In Gaza, bombings in Rafah seemed to intensify the evening after Resolution 2728 passed. Ceasefires or peace only happen when men with guns want it or when it seems the better option for them. But what happens in this room does matter for accountability, for setting standards we expect everyone to abide by. Therefore, we also call upon the Secretary General to list all parties to the conflict as perpetrators of grave violations against children in the upcoming annual report on children and armed conflict. We are facing a crisis of accountability and impunity, and it must be addressed to break the cycle of violence and prevent further violence in the future. What I saw and heard in Gaza last week was dehumanizing, not only for the people in Gaza. It is dehumanizing for all of us if we stand by and let it happen. The world, people in this room, have the tools to address it. You merely lack the political will to use them. On behalf of all the children in Gaza, I urge you to act. Thank you.
I thank you for your very important and impactful briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I pass the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham and Mrs. Janti Soerpito for their briefing. We greatly admire and appreciate your work for those in need. We express our sincere condolences to all families of aid workers who have been killed by the Israeli occupying power in Gaza. Today, we are gathered once again as the aggression against the innocent Palestinian civilian reach for its 6-month mark in 2 days. 6 months. 6 months of barbarity and collective punishment. 6 months of suffering for the people of Gaza. 6 months that test the humanity of each and every one of us. 6 months that test the international order and our ability to preserve coexistence for future generations. 6 months that pushed the entire population of Gaza into famine. The ICG observed, and I quote, Palestinians in Gaza are no longer facing only a risk of famine, but that famine is setting in. To address this situation, the ICG issued 2 orders to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people. However, the Israeli occupying power did not comply. Finally, the Security Council also acted by demanding an immediate ceasefire through its Resolution 2728. Yet, more than 10 days after its adoption, the occupying power blatantly refuses to implement it. A conduct unworthy of a United Nations member bound under Article 25 of the Charter to carry out the decision of the Security Council. Yet, it is not surprising from a killing machine that commits all violation of international law with total impunity. They are confident that they will be never held accountable. And the occupying power continues to commit more and more crime, more and more violation. We must put an end to this aberration. Madam President, the crime perpetrated against World Central Kitchen personnel is not surprising and is no exception. It was an attack that targeted them systematically, car by car, as stated by Chief Jose Andres, the founder of World Central Kitchen. It is just a new chapter in the book of crimes committed. The victims are not Palestinian. Their savage killing is evenly commendable. The large media coverage and outrage would be unjustified if it is not as equal as to that on the killing of Palestinian civilians. Should we forget that the Israeli occupying power has killed more than 33,000 Palestinians, of whom over 70% were children and women, innocent children and women, since October the 7th. Should we recall that 224 aid workers have been killed by the occupying power since October the 7th? Should we recall that 484 health workers were killed since October the 7th? The occupying powers' reaction to this horrible incident is shameful. Why do these 7 people deserve apologies from the highest occupying authorities and not the thousands of innocent Palestinians massacred during these last 6 months? We have heard no apologies from those who proclaim to be peace lovers. They prove with their actions Palestinians are not as human beings as others. They are human animals, they said. For us, all lives matter. Palestinian lives matter. All lives matter. And to those who believe in the investigation and justice of the Israeli occupying power, I say, where is justice to Rachel Corrie? Where is justice for James Miller? And where is justice for Tom Herndal, to name a few? These peace activists were killed years ago, and no justice have been delivered to them. The killing of humanitarian workers in Gaza is only a continuation of the doctrine of oppression and occupation practices in Palestine. Kill Palestinians and their sympathizers. You have carte blanche. And once again, the verdict will be that these were regrettable incidents. And the victim endangered themselves by knowingly entering a war zone, even within the confliction. Madam President, since the start of the aggression, the UN agencies, NGOs, humanitarian actors, and member states have said that the confliction mechanism in Gaza is not working. Simply is not working. Not for lack of coordination, but rather a deliberate act to spread fear among Palestinians and those who want to help them. We have said it, and we repeat it again today. Humanitarian actors cannot be asked to serve at the peril of their lives. There must be assured of the condition that allow them to reach those in need. And only an immediate ceasefire can create those conditions. Otherwise, the Palestinian population risks being left to fend for itself, and the worst will be inevitable. Thousands of deaths from starvation, as predicted by various reports. A situation that will further deteriorate with the decision to freeze the world central kitchen operations and the maritime corridor from Cyprus. A decision taken while the Israeli occupying power persists in its campaign and attempt to block and to dismantle UNRWA, the backbone of the UN humanitarian operation in Gaza. The international community, the Security Council, cannot remain inert as life drains from Gaza. In the name of humanity, we must act, and we must act now. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria and pass the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam President, thank you for convening this meeting. Allow me to also express appreciation to our briefers, Mr. Rajasingham and Ms. Sarepto, for the insight they provided on the worsening crisis in the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly as it relates to the food security situation and the threatening conditions under which humanitarian workers are operating. Madam President, colleagues, 2 weeks ago, this Council met and demanded an immediate ceasefire in Gaza for the month of Ramadan and envisaged that this ceasefire would pave the way for a permanent end to the fighting. It was also envisaged that this ceasefire would create the conditions for facilitating the expansion of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Regrettably, Resolution 2728 is being completely disregarded while the humanitarian situation worsens. In the days since 25th of March, the Al-Shifa hospital was completely destroyed, and the world witnessed a most brutal and daring attack on a convoy of the World Central Kitchen, resulting in the death of 7 team members. Guyana commiserates with the families of all those who lost their lives in these tragic circumstances. We have time and again highlighted the fact that deconfliction and notification mechanisms are not functioning, resulting in serious compromises to the safety and security of humanitarian workers in the Gaza Strip. Consequently, more than 200 aid workers have been killed in the occupied Palestinian territory since October 2023. These indiscriminate killings of humanitarian personnel are an egregious illegality which must be investigated, and the perpetrators must be held accountable. A pattern has emerged in this conflict of indiscriminate attacks on humanitarian workers and agencies, including UN agencies. Palestinian civilians ultimately bear the brunt of these actions. When humanitarian agencies decide to restrict or suspend their operations owing to the dangerous conditions in the Gaza Strip, the number of civilians they can assist decreases. The humanitarian situation thus worsens. The strategy of collective punishment that is being inflicted on the Palestinian people has incorporated starvation as a method of warfare, evidenced by, inter alia, savage attacks on those attempting to meet the needs of starving Palestinians. Palestinians themselves have been fatally attacked while seeking sustenance. We are familiar with the results of this strategy: man-made malnutrition, man-made famine, disease, and death. We recall the latest IPC report, which projected famine in the northern governorates of Gaza between mid-March and end of May. Guyana believes that famine is already present in Gaza, taking note, for example, of the assessment by UNICEF in March that 1 in 3 children under 2 years of age is acutely malnourished in the north, and reports by UNICEF that several children, including babies, have died from malnutrition. Those children who manage to survive will likely face serious challenges into adulthood, affecting their quality of life and productivity, and therefore their capacity to contribute to the development of their homeland. One can only conclude then that there is method to this madness that has been unleashed on Palestinians in Gaza, and it threatens the very survival of the nation. International humanitarian law prohibits the use of starvation as a weapon of warfare. By extension, those who seek to provide humanitarian relief to starving civilians in armed conflict should be protected and not targeted. Guyana condemns in the strongest terms all attacks on humanitarian workers and UN personnel operating in the Gaza Strip, and calls on Israel to uphold its obligations under international law. Madam President, dear colleagues, Guyana also underscores the critical work of agencies such as UNRWA in providing food assistance, medical care, emergency aid, and other critical support to the Palestinian people. We call on the Israeli authorities to reverse their decision and allow UNRWA to deliver life-saving services to the people in the north of Gaza. We stress the need to ensure adequate funding for UNRWA and call on member states to scale up their contributions to the agency as a direct investment in the humanitarian response in Gaza. We also stress the importance of additional routes into Gaza, particularly land routes. We acknowledge the announcement by Israel to temporarily open the Erez crossing and to allow the use of the Ashdod port. We hope that these would not be rendered almost useless by burdensome verification processes. In closing, Guyana calls for the upholding of international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Accountability is a critical element of international law, and we urge this Council to ensure that the occupying power does not continue its flagrant violations of international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana and pass the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I also want to thank the briefers, Mr. Rajasingham and Ms. Suripto. Colleagues, there are 15 of us around this table in the Security Council. 15 of us with responsibility to protect civilians in Gaza. Were we meeting in the north of Gaza today, all 15 of us would be skipping meals in the past months. 10 of us would go entire days and nights without eating. Half of us would be in desperate need of humanitarian aid. And finally, at least 5 of us would be parents to severely, acutely malnourished children, life-threatening and with lifelong consequences. We are not meeting in Gaza, but listening to Ms. Seripto, maybe we should have met in Gaza. We are meeting at the UN Security Council, where we know very well that looming famine in the north of Gaza and the risk of famine across the rest of the Gaza Strip can be prevented. Conflict-induced and man-made famine means the absolute failure of the international community and gross violation of the international humanitarian law. Starvation is used as a weapon of war. Waiting for a famine declaration will not change anything on the ground, unfortunately. But we know what will: an immediate ceasefire. Full, safe, secure, and unhindered humanitarian access, in particular through land, to provide safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, water, and medicines will. The restoration of health, water, and sanitation services and energy provision will. The adequate shelters for civilians will. Madam President, for the aid to reach people in need, we need humanitarian workers, the most brave and empathetic souls that humanity can produce. They're sacrificing their security, their lives, to save others. They must be able to fulfill their calling without constant fear. They must be granted safety, security, freedom of movement, and the necessary equipment and support. We repeat our continuous call for full respect of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. This includes ensuring the safety and security of UN and all other personnel engaged in humanitarian relief activities. We are profoundly grateful for the efforts and work of the Secretary General and the entire UN system, in particular UNRWA, UN agencies, humanitarian and medical organizations, and their staff. I want to be clear. Nothing in this war happens by chance. The conduct of this war is a choice. Disrespect of international humanitarian law is a choice. And the consequences of this war, with unprecedented deaths and destruction, and children too weak to cry, cannot be but a choice. With the appalling attack on the World Central Kitchen, earlier on UNRWA, Médecins Sans Frontières, and others, the number of humanitarian workers killed in Gaza has reached 224. We condemn all attacks on humanitarian, medical, and UN personnel in Gaza and underline our call for accountability. The faces of humanity left in Gaza are under attack and have been for the past 6 months. So, colleagues, this Council has adopted 3 resolutions on the situation in Gaza. Most recently, Resolution 2728, calling for an immediate ceasefire leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire, the release of hostages, and delivery of humanitarian aid. ICG orders are binding. Security Council resolutions are binding for each and every UN member state. They must be implemented. International order and our collective security depend on respect for the UN Charter, international law, and the commitments that we all adhere to. This Sunday, we will mark 6 months of the war in Gaza. 6 months later, it's imperative to reflect on the enduring suffering of Gaza's civilians and hostages, not merely through discussions, but through decisive, impactful actions. 6 months of destruction and devastation cannot be a milestone we should mark with merely a meeting of the Security Council. We have seen the spillover effects of this conflict in almost the entire Middle East region. The conflict in Gaza is a threat to international peace and security. And this Council should make sure to stop it. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia and pass the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Je vous remercie d'avoir convoqué cette réunion d'urgence et les intervenants pour leurs exposés. Il y a un mois, ce Conseil s'est réuni à la demande du Guyana et de la Suisse en tant que point focaux informel sur la thématique de faim et conflit armé, alertant de l'insécurité alimentaire dans la bande de Gaza. Nous avions entendu les Nations Unies insister sur le fait que sans un cessez-le-feu immédiat, la famine à Gaza était presque inévitable. Malgré l'adoption de la résolution 2728 qui exige un cessez-le-feu immédiat, les combats se poursuivent et l'insécurité alimentaire s'est aggravée. Le manque d'accès à la nourriture et de l'insuffisance de l'approvisionnement en eau, de l'agriculture et de la production alimentaire est catastrophique pour la population de la bande de Gaza. La Suisse exprime son plus grand respect pour tous les humanitaires qui risquent leur vie en portant secours. Nos pensées vont aujourd'hui aux organisations et aux familles de quelques 200 travailleurs et travailleuses humanitaires qui ont été tués à Gaza depuis le 7 octobre. Les attaques contre les humanitaires constituent une violation du droit international humanitaire et doivent cesser immédiatement. À cette fin, des mesures concrètes de déconfliction doivent être mises en place. La bande de Gaza est rapidement devenue l'endroit le plus dangereux pour les humanitaires. L'insécurité généralisée et les restrictions de mouvement forcent les organisations humanitaires à suspendre leur opération, et c'est au moment où les besoins humanitaires sont le plus importants. Par conséquent, l'ensemble du système d'aide risque de s'effondrer et le maintien de corridors d'aide maritime en provenance de Chypre est notamment en péril. L'UNRWA ainsi que d'autres organisations humanitaires doivent avoir un accès sans entrave à la population dans le besoin. Chaque jour compte. La classification intégrée des phases de la sécurité alimentaire IPC a mis en garde contre un risque de famine d'ici à la fin du mois de mai 2024. Selon UNICEF, Gaza connaît le pire niveau de malnutrition infantile au monde. La malnutrition en début de vie peut entraîner un retard de croissance, des troubles du développement cognitif, et une plus grande vulnérabilité aux infections et aux maladies. Ces impacts sont irréversibles et affecteront ces enfants toute leur vie. Madame la Présidente, le 28 mars 2024, la Cour internationale de justice a demandé à Israël de travailler en étroite collaboration avec l'ONU afin d'assurer sans restriction et à grande échelle la fourniture par toutes les parties intéressées de services de base et de l'aide humanitaire requise sous toute urgence. La Suisse rappelle que les mesures conservatoires décidées par la Cour internationale de justice le 26 janvier et le 28 mars 2024 sont contraignantes pour les parties. Elle attend donc d'Israël qu'il s'y conforme. Aussi, nous appelons une fois de plus les parties au strict respect du droit international, notamment du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. La Suisse reste très préoccupée par l'impact des hostilités sur la population civile. Une opération de large envergure à Rafah ne doit pas avoir lieu, étant donné les conséquences humanitaires catastrophiques qu'il aurait. En outre, les résolutions 2712, 2720 et 2728 de ce Conseil doivent être mises en œuvre instamment. Tous les otages encore détenus à Gaza doivent être libérés immédiatement et sans condition. Un cessez-le-feu immédiat menant à un cessez-le-feu durable est essentiel pour protéger les vies et de prévenir la famine. En l'absence de garanties de sécurité fiables, les humanitaires ne peuvent s'acquitter de leur mandat à sauver des vies et à venir en aide aux populations dans le besoin. Nous devons revenir à l'humanité. Un cessez-le-feu immédiat est le seul moyen de ne pas perdre plus de vies civiles. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland and pass the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking Director Rajasingham and President Siripto for briefing us today. The UK is appalled by the killing of 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers, including 3 of our British nationals, in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza on the 1st of April. bringing the number of humanitarian staff killed so far to over 200. I share our deep and sincere condolences with their families and with all those who have lost loved ones during this war. Our Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary spoke immediately with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israeli Foreign Minister Katz to ask for a transparent investigation. We will study carefully the results of the investigation from the Israeli government, and we welcome the commitments Israel has made since on humanitarian operations. President, aid workers should never be targeted. Over 200 have been killed in this conflict. Israel must do much more to protect them and to ensure their safety so they can deliver urgently needed life-saving humanitarian assistance. For this to happen, we call for 3 major changes. First, Israel must make significant, concrete changes to put in place an effective deconfliction mechanism immediately. It is imperative that those doing life-saving work are properly protected and allowed full, unhindered access to conduct their work safely. Second, we welcome the steps Israel has now taken and call on it to do everything necessary to allow effective humanitarian relief. We welcome the assurances that Israel has given to UN agencies and others that it will now open Ashdod port, more land crossings into Gaza, increase quantities and types of aid allowed to enter by land, and improve water supplies. The amount of aid getting in has, until now, been insufficient. Full, unhindered access, as well as an enabling operating environment for distribution, is necessary to meet humanitarian needs and avoid famine. And all parties must comply fully with international humanitarian law and work with Under-Secretary-General Karg to scale up assistance and implement Resolution 2720 without delay. Finally, we need to see major and immediate changes in the conduct of Israel's military campaign to protect civilians. I reiterate the UK's call for the immediate implementation of Resolution 2728. This weekend, it will be 6 months since Israel suffered the worst terror attack in its history. Throughout this crisis, the UK has been unequivocal in our condemnation of Hamas and our demand for the unconditional release of the hostages. We must see an immediate cessation of hostilities to get aid in and hostages out, leading to progress towards a sustainable ceasefire. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom and pass the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam Chair,
благодарим директору КГВ ООН Рамеша Раджисинхама, а также докладчицу гражданского общества.
UN OCHA Ramesh Rajasingham,
Okay. My goodness, what an eventful morning today. One for the memoirs.
It's an aftershock of the earthquake. Shall I continue?
Yes, please continue.
Madam Chair, we'd like to thank the Director from UN OCHA, Ramesh Rajasingham, and Ms. Yanti Saripto, a civil society representative, for their briefings about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, where, despite UN Security Council Resolution 2728, which demands an immediate ceasefire, the ruthless military operation of the IDF continues. Until the end of the Muslim world's holy month of Ramadan, well, it's ending in just 4 days' time. But judging by the bellicose rhetoric of the leadership of West Jerusalem, no truce, which is directly demanded by Resolution 2728, even for this short stretch of time, is foreseen. As a result, in the last 24 hours alone, in the enclave, 62 people died. The total number of lives claimed in the Gaza Strip is over 33,000 Palestinians. Of them, 13,000 are children. Roughly 12,000 in addition are assumed killed. Their bodies are buried under the ruins into which practically the entire territory of the enclave has turned into. 70% of buildings have been destroyed. Against this backdrop, the Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, Ms. Albanese, concluded that Israel has met the threshold for committing the crime of genocide. At the same time, Ms. Albanese called this a humanitarian camouflage, that is, the Israeli authorities' assertion that international humanitarian law is supposedly being upheld during the military operation in the Gaza Strip, as well as Israel's references to self-defense and the fight against terrorism in this context. Madam President, with each passing day, the humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate. Every single day, we get more and more chilling data delivered to us. We'd like to repeat our position. In order to prevent a humanitarian apocalypse and mass hunger in Gaza, what we urgently need is a genuine ceasefire and for Israel to respect international humanitarian law. That is the only way to avoid further victims in this tragedy. With the military operation in the Strip ongoing, adequate provision of humanitarian, including food assistance, is impossible. Since the escalation in Gaza began, the Security Council has adopted 2 dedicated humanitarian resolutions, which, just like the resolution which calls for a ceasefire, demands a ceasefire 2728, contain provisions about unfettered humanitarian access to those in need and unconditional respect for the obligations established by international humanitarian law to ensure minimum conditions for the work of humanitarian aid agencies. Israel isn't fulfilling those either. We believe that the Council needs to agree on measures which should be adopted vis-à-vis West Jerusalem in response to Israel's flagrant disregard of Security Council decisions and the UN Charter. For example, these measures could include an arms embargo or other types of sanctions. In so doing, the Council should stand in unison. It's unacceptable for some members of the Council to send signals which cast doubt on the need to implement resolutions being adopted by the Council. Madam President, palliative measures won't improve the situation in the Gaza Strip. These palliative measures include humanitarian aid drops and the building of a temporary maritime pier. Aid agencies themselves have concluded that these measures are purely symbolic in nature. They don't help the regular provision of assistance at scale. What's more is, dozens of Palestinians perished and drowned when these measures were implemented. Now is not the time for humanitarian PR, which is being used as a cover for the unwillingness or the inability to take measures to end the bloodshed and ensure the safe and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance. Madam President, the situation is significantly exacerbated by Israel hyping up the crisis surrounding UNRWA, which is a unique body providing comprehensive assistance to 6 million Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory and in neighboring Arab states. And yet, Israel hasn't submitted information confirming the allegations it leveled against UNRWA staff. Despite this, Washington took a legislative legislative decision to bar funding to UNRWA. At the same time, a series of Western states, although they did resume their contributions to the organization's budget, they did so on the reservation that these funds shouldn't be used to finance the work of the agency in Gaza. A few words about the information war being waged by Western Jerusalem against UNRWA. As a result of groundless allegations, the veracity of which raises serious doubts, the agency is facing serious reputational and financial difficulties. But that's not the main thing.
Главное то, что даже та скромная помощь, которую в данную минуту могла бы быть оказана этой ООНовской структуре, в результате не предоставляется. Вдобавок ко всему, израильские власти отказали БАПОР в гуманитарном доступе на север Газы, где наиболее тяжелая обстановка. Этой обструкции должен быть положен конец. Мы все прекрасно понимаем, что на Сбри и в Газе и прилегающих арабских странах БАПОР нет альтернативы. Члены Совета не должны здесь подыгрывать Израилю, который начал свой крестовый поход против БАПОР задолго до событий 7 октября. Несколько слов о безопасности гуманитарных работников. Не далее, как во вторник, в результате целенаправленного израильского обстрела погибли 7 сотрудников волонтерской организации Эти люди сопровождали необходимую газовитянам продовольственную помощь. Этот инцидент вызвал бурную реакцию и негодование в западных столицах, поскольку погибшие в основном жители западных государств. В Вашингтоне даже сподвиглись на необычайно острую критику своего ближневосточного союзника. В целом же за время конфликта ракетные удары Израиля по гуманитарным объектам в Газе, по школам и больницам привели уже к гибели 224 гуманитарных работников, не говоря уже о десятках тысячах погибших газовитян. Мы вновь задаемся простым вопросом. Будут ли проведены расследования этих злодеяний? Будет ли Совет требовать этого от Израиля? Или в фокус внимания наших западных коллег попадают только случаи гибели их соотечественников? Что на этот счет планирует предпринять руководство секретариата ООН, которое уже лишило 179 исполнявших свой героический долг сотрудников? Почему израильские обвинения против БАПОР в ООН начали отрабатывать немедленно, а по этим вопиющим случаям гибели сотрудников ООН расследование, насколько мы можем судить, даже не начиналось?
As far as we can tell, the investigation of these instances hasn't even begun.
Госпожа председатель, по сути, то, что мы сейчас наблюдаем в Газе, это осада и блокада с целью вызвать голод среди мирного населения и наглядный пример использования голода в качестве метода ведения войны. Напомним, такие действия прямо запрещены положением международного гуманитарного права и профильной резолюции Совета Безопасности 2417. Решение оккупирующей державы о временном открытии погранперехода ЭРЕЦ принято аккурат накануне нашего заседания, чтобы снизить накал упомянутого возмущения западных столиц общей картины внимания. Главное требование Совета Безопасности — немедленно прекратить огонь, Израиль так и не выполнил. Совет обязан добиться выполнения в полном объеме всеми сторонами конфликта всех своих решений, направленных на прекращение насилия в Газе, наращивание гуманитарной помощи мирным жителям сектора и недопущение их насильственного переселения. Только после этого можно задуматься о новых инициативах, направленных на долгосрочное урегулирование палестино-израильского конфликта на известных международных правовых основах.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation and pass the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Mr. Rajanshinan and Ms. Soelipto for their valuable briefings. We are nearing 6 months since the conflict in Gaza erupted due to Hamas' terrifying attacks on Israel. Recent developments only seem to be worsening the situation on the ground. Despite last week's adoption of Security Council Resolution 2728, demanding immediate ceasefire during the holy month of Ramadan, hostilities continued unabated. On April 2nd, we witnessed the killing of 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers by multiple Israeli strikes in Gaza, sparkling global outrage. Already, more than 220 humanitarian workers lost their lives. Japan extends sincere condolences to the colleagues and the families of the victims. These incidents have forced humanitarian organizations to suspend their operations, which create catastrophic impacts on the lives of people in Gaza, who desperately need life-saving assistance. Attacks on humanitarian workers are absolutely unacceptable. In this vein, Japan urges Israel for necessary measures to prevent recurrence of such incidents. Humanitarian crisis in Gaza is spiraling deeper into catastrophe. People in Gaza face starvation, the spread of preventable diseases, and unimaginable suffering. Famine is there. Even though many countries, including Japan, have resumed funding for UNRWA, if attacks on humanitarian workers continue, they cannot carry out their work. This week, we heard from the representative from UNICEF that dozens of children in northern Gaza have reportedly died from malnutrition and dehydration. We must exert all our efforts to getting aid into Gaza through all possible means, including by land, air, and sea. Those in Gaza cannot wait another day. Japan hopes the recent announcement regarding the opening of the Izez crossing will allow more humanitarian aid to reach people in Gaza. For this catastrophic nightmare to end, Japan urges all concerned parties to achieve an immediate ceasefire. The imperative to improve the humanitarian situation without further delay in accordance with the Security Council Resolution 2728. We must save the lives of civilians, including innocent children, by silencing the guns, expediting humanitarian deliveries into Gaza, and working towards the release of hostages. Lastly, we remain strongly supportive of the ongoing diplomatic efforts led by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar to this end. We will continue to play our role in achieving peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan and pass the floor to the representative of China.
主席女士，我感谢阿尔及利亚、圭亚那和斯洛文尼亚参与召开今天的会议，感谢2位通报人的通报。加沙冲突爆发已有6个月，33000多名无辜平民在战火中丧生，上百万民众在前所未有的人道灾难中绝望挣扎。安理会3月25日通过了第2728号决议，要求加沙立即停火。但令人心痛的是，10多天来，战事还在持续。加沙的平民和人道工作者每天都面临枪林弹雨的危险，每天都有近百的无辜妇女儿童在爆炸、饥饿、疾病中死亡。加沙的悲剧考验着人类的良知，考验着安理会的信誉。第一，全面落实第2728号决议是当务之急。安理会所有决议都具有约束力，这是联合国宪章规定的义务，这是每个成员国加入联合国时都做出的承诺。我们敦促以色列立即执行决议要求，停止对加沙的军事进攻，停止对加沙民众的集体惩罚。我们呼吁对当事方有重要影响的大国，为推动决议落实发挥积极作用。我们支持安理会为落实第2728号决议采取进一步必要行动。第二，缓解加沙人道灾难刻不容缓。 加沙已经发生严重饥荒和医疗系统瘫痪，人道灾难超乎想象。以色列必须全面执行国际法院发布的临时措施命令，立即解除对加沙的封锁和对人道准入的设障，全面开放拉法和所有陆路过境点，保障人道物资快速、充足、安全准入。第三，以色列必须停止对人道机构和人员的攻击。中方对近日以色列袭击人道运输车队的行为予以强烈谴责。对人道工作者的袭击令人震惊，也警示我们，冲突以来，以色列的袭击已导致联合国170多名工作人员丧生，加沙民众赖以为生的人道救援设施和物资已被毁坏殆尽。以色列必须遵守国际法和国际人道法，为人道机构开展援助提供配合和安全保障。停止对联合国近东巴勒斯坦难民救济和工程处的恶意攻击和限制。主席女士，本轮冲突教训惨烈，再次警示我们，只有全面落实两国方案，实现巴勒斯坦独立建国，纠正巴勒斯坦人民长期遭受的历史不公，才能彻底走出巴以冲突的恶性循环。作为关键一步，我们坚定支持巴勒斯坦成为联合国正式会员国，支持安理会尽快采取行动。我们同时倡议召开更大规模、更具权威、更有时效的国际和会，制定落实两国方案的时间表和路线图。中方将继续同国际社会一道，为推动早日平息加沙战火、缓解人道灾难、落实两国方案做出不懈努力。谢谢主席。
Thank you, Madam President. I thank the representative of China and pass the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President,
je remercie Monsieur Rajasingham et Madame Soripto pour leur présentation. La France a condamné la frappe israélienne qui a causé la mort de 7 personnels humanitaires de l'ONG World Central Kitchen. Elle a demandé aux autorités israéliennes de mener une enquête approfondie et de punir les responsables. Celles-ci ont pris cet engagement et devront s'y tenir. 7 personnels humanitaires ont donc été tués alors qu'ils tentaient de porter assistance à des populations civiles en état de quasi-famine. Leur mort s'ajoute, ne l'oublions pas, à celle de 177 personnels de l'UNRWA. Pour les Nations Unies, ce bilan est le plus lourd depuis la création de l'organisation. La protection des travailleurs humanitaires doit être garantie en toutes circonstances. Le droit de la guerre et les principes de précaution et de proportionnalité et le droit international humanitaire doivent être respectés. 2 millions de personnes manquent de tout à Gaza. Il est essentiel de pouvoir acheminer massivement l'aide et de garantir un accès complet conformément aux résolutions adoptées par ce Conseil. Le rôle de coordination des Nations Unies est essentiel, celui de l'UNRWA également. La France prend note des mesures annoncées ce jour par le gouvernement israélien. Elle l'appelle à mettre en œuvre ces annonces sans délai et à respecter intégralement le droit international humanitaire. Madame la Présidente, la France exige la pleine mise en œuvre de la résolution 2728 du Conseil de sécurité et un cessez-le-feu immédiat et durable. À Gaza, nous ne sommes pas confrontés à une catastrophe naturelle.
we're
La
not
crise
saying a natural
humanitaire découle
disaster.
de la guerre.
The humanitarian
Et la meilleure réponse
catastrophe is a result
humanitaire,
of
c'est
war,
que
and the
la
best
guerre
humanitarian
cesse.
response is for the war to
La France
end.
réaffirme sa
France
ferme
would like to
opposition
reiterate
à
its
une offensive
staunch
terrestre à
opposition
Rafah
to a
qui
ground
entraînerait
offensive in
une
Rafah, which
catastrophe
would result in a
humanitaire sans
humanitarian
précédent.
catastrophe
Elle
on an
exige aussi la
unprecedented scale.
libération
We also demand
immédiate
the
et
immediate and
inconditionnelle des
unconditional
otages détenus par le Hamas
release of
et d'autres
hostages
groupes
detained by Hamas
terroristes. Elle
and other
rappelle
terrorist groups.
sa condamnation
We'd
des
like to
attaques
reiterate
terroristes,
our
y compris des
condemnation
violences
of
sexuelles
terrorist attacks,
perpétrées le 9
including sexual
octobre.
violence, which have been
Madame la
committed
Présidente,
on the 7th of
parvenir
October.
à un
Madam
cessez-le-feu est une
Achieving
priorité
a ceasefire
absolue de
is
la
a top
France.
priority for France.
Traitons la cause et
Let's
pas
address
uniquement les
the
symptômes.
root cause, not just the
Mais il est
symptoms of this
grand
problem.
temps aussi
It is
de
high time
poser enfin les bases
us
d'un
to,
règlement
at
politique
last,
pour
lay the
mettre en
groundwork for
œuvre
a
la
political
solution des
settlement
deux
so
États.
as to implement the
Celle-ci est la
two-state solution.
seule qui puisse
This
assurer
solution is
aux
the
Israéliens
only way
et aux
to
Palestiniens la
furnish
paix et la sécurité.
Israelis
La
and
France est
Palestinians with
mobilisée en
peace
ce
and
sens auprès
security.
des partis
France is
et
actively
avec l'ensemble
engaged
des
to this
partenaires
end, working
régionaux
with
et
parties
internationaux.
and all
Le
regional
projet de
international
résolution
partners.
que
The
nous avons
draft
soumis
resolution,
aux
which
membres de
we've
ce
submitted
Conseil
for the
s'inscrit
consideration
dans cette
of Security Council
perspective
members is
et
part and parcel
je
of
les
this
appelle
effort.
tous
I
à
call
le
on all
soutenir.
council members to
Je vous
express their
remercie.
support for that resolution. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France and pass the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam
En
President.
primer lugar, agradezco a los
I'd
oradores de
like
esta
to
mañana,
begin by
señor Raja
thanking
Singham
this
y
morning's
señora
briefers,
Sorito,
Mr.
por sus
Raja Singham
oportunos y
and
sombríos
Ms.
informes.
Saripto, for their
Reitero el
timely and
apoyo del
grim
Ecuador a las
reports.
labores
I
valiosas y
reiterate
sacrificadas
Ecuador's
del
support for the
personal de
brave and
Naciones Unidas
self-sacrificing
y
work
sus
of
agencias
UN
en zona de
staff
conflicto.
and agencies in the
Deseo
conflict
también
zone.
reconocer y valorar la
I
heroica
also
tarea
would
del
like to
personal
acknowledge
humanitario
and commend
que,
the heroic work of
desde
the
los condenables actos
humanitarian
terroristas
staff
perpetrados
who,
por
since
Hamas en
the
octubre pasado,
condemnable
arriesga
terrorist
su vida
acts
por
carried out
entregar
by
alimentos
Hamas
o por salvar a
last
otras
October
personas
are
en
risking
condiciones cada
their
vez más
lives
difíciles.
to
Rindo
provide
especial
food and to
homenaje
save
al personal
lives
humanitario que ha perdido su
in
vida en este
increasingly
conflicto,
difficult
en
conditions.
particular a los
I
7
pay
trabajadores
particular
del World
tribute to the
Central
humanitarian
Kitchen,
staff who've lost
asesinados
their
esta
lives in this
semana, y
conflict, in
envío
particular the
condolencias a sus
7 World
países de
Central
origen y a sus
Kitchen
familias.
staff
El
killed this
secretario
week, and we
general
extend our
se ha
condolences to their
referido en
countries
este
of
tema de forma
origin
clara
and their
esta misma
families.
mañana.
This morning, the Secretary General
Señor
explicitly
Presidente,
referred to this matter.
el personal humanitario no debe ser objeto de ataques,
Humanitarian staff
nunca,
must
en
not
ninguna
be
circunstancia,
the target of
bajo
attacks
ningún
ever,
pretexto.
under any circumstances,
No hay justificación
under any
alguna para
pretext.
hacerlo.
There is no
Este tipo de
justification
actos
whatsoever for this to happen.
debe ser investigado
These
y
types
deben
of acts
determinarse
must be
responsabilidades.
investigated, and those responsible must be held to account.
Los principios del derecho internacional humanitario no son de
The
cumplimiento
compliance with the
voluntario
principles of
y no
international
dependen de la
humanitarian law are
reciprocidad.
not voluntary
La
and do not
suspensión de
require
actividades humanitarias por
reciprocity.
falta de
The
condiciones
suspension
mínimas de
of
protección
humanitarian
y seguridad
activities due
agrava la ya
to
profunda
a lack
crisis
of minimal
alimentaria.
protection and security
Es
standards
imperativo
has
revertir esta
worsened the
situación.
already very
Para el
serious
efecto,
food crisis.
la
We
labor de la
must
UNRWA
reverse
es de
this
vital
situation.
importancia
To that
y
end,
debe
the
ser
work of
apoyada.
UNRWA is vitally
Llamamos a
important
todos
and
los que puedan
requires
hacerlo a
support,
contribuir a
and we call
financiar
on
sus
those in a
operaciones,
position to
cuya
do so
continuidad
to make a
es un factor
financial
de estabilidad en
contribution
toda
to
la
their
región.
operations. Their
Señora
continued
Presidenta,
work is a factor of
la
stability
semana
throughout
pasada
the
el Consejo
region.
de Seguridad
Madam President,
adoptó una
last week the
resolución en
Security
la que
Council
demanda un
adopted
cese al fuego
resolution
inmediato
calling for the
durante el mes
immediate
de Ramadán
ceasefire
y la
during the month of
liberación
Ramadan
incondicional
and the
e
unconditional
inmediata de
and
los rehenes
immediate
que aún siguen
release of
en manos de
hostages
Hamas.
who remain in the hands
Asimismo,
of Hamas.
la resolución
At the same time, Resolution
2728 señala la necesidad
2728
de
points
ampliar
to
el
the
flujo de
need
asistencia
to
humanitaria en
increase
Gaza.
the flow of humanitarian assistance to Gaza.
La implementación oportuna
The
de esta
timely
decisión del
implementation
Consejo
of this council
habría evitado la
decision
muerte del personal
would have
humanitario,
avoided the death of
habría
humanitarian
permitido que los
staff,
rehenes se
it would
reúnan
have enabled the
ya con sus
hostages to be
familiares y
reunited
habría
with their
incrementado
families,
la ayuda
and
a la
it would have
población
increased
civil.
aid to the
Por
civilian
esto,
population. For
reitero el
this reason,
llamado
we
a la
reiterate our
completa e
appeal
inmediata
for the full and
implementación de las
immediate
resoluciones
implementation of
2712,
resolutions 2712, 2720,
2728
and
a fin de evitar más
2728
muertes y
in order
destrucción.
to avoid
Muchas
further
gracias.
death and destruction. Thank you. you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador and pass the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Director Rajasingham for today's briefing on the situation in the Gaza Strip. I also appreciate Ms. Sueripto for her sobering testimony on what is happening on the ground. As we are now nearing 6 months since the current catastrophe started, it is gravely dismaying to witness that hostilities continue unabated, causing devastating humanitarian consequences in Gaza. 3 days ago, the WHO announced Al-Shifa Medical Complex in Gaza City, the largest hospital in Gaza, is no longer functional after Israel's military operation, further threatening the already precarious health system in the Gaza Strip. Despite international efforts, including through maritime corridors and airdrops, Gaza is now facing a catastrophic food crisis due to the significant restrictions to land deliveries of life-saving assistance in unsafe conditions. As civilian infrastructure for food production and distribution has been severely damaged, Gaza cannot sustain itself without outside assistance. Against this disturbing backdrop, my delegation is deeply appalled by the killing of 7 World Central Kitchen staff members in an IDF strike, who were simply delivering life-saving humanitarian assistance in the Gaza Strip. It is reported the World Central Kitchen alone has provided more than 35 million hot meals across Gaza since the outset of the current catastrophe. Korea extends its deep condolences and consolations to the victims of this incident and their bereaved families, and wishes a speedy recovery for the injured. Now, several key humanitarian aid organizations on the ground, including World Central Kitchen, are reported to have suspended the operations following this devastating incident. This is dismaying development, as the international community is struggling to expand humanitarian aid at scale throughout Gaza. Madam President, let me clearly repeat our shared tenet enshrined in international humanitarian laws. All parties to conflicts must not attack humanitarian workers, and they must ensure unhindered access to humanitarian assistance. All barriers to the provisions of humanitarian assistance in Gaza should be lifted as demanded by a Security Council Resolution 2728. We hope Israeli government's announcements yesterday on steps to increase aid flow to Gaza leads to tangible improvements on the ground. At the same time, humanitarian notification procedures and deconfliction mechanisms should be enhanced to stop recurrence of incidents like the deaths of World Central Kitchen member staffs. Korea re-emphasized that Resolution 2720 adopted last month should be implemented and calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, as this is the only viable way to ensure safe and unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea and pass the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you for your briefings, Director Rajasingham and CEO Soripto. The Security Council and General Assembly have affirmed the imperative of protecting humanitarian personnel, including Resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728. As we have heard today, tragically, this has not been heeded by the parties in Gaza. One of the most recent pieces of evidence of this was the tragic strike on a World Central Kitchen convoy, which killed several humanitarian workers on April 1. As President Biden said on Tuesday, the United States is outraged and heartbroken at the deaths of these individuals who were providing food to starving civilians in the middle of a war. These workers were brave and selfless. They show the best of what humanity has to offer when the going really gets tough. An incident such as this should never have happened and must never happen again. We all know, moreover, this was not a standalone incident. This conflict has been one of the worst in recent memory in terms of the number of aid workers who have been killed. More than 220 humanitarian workers have perished since October 7th in Gaza, some while on duty. Many more have been injured. These incidents are unacceptable. Humanitarian personnel must be protected, full stop. We are deeply concerned Israel has not done enough to protect humanitarian aid workers or civilians. For that reason, the resolution the United States introduced last month in this Council demanded all parties to the conflict fully respect humanitarian notification and deconfliction mechanisms and remediate any deficiencies. Although Russia and China vetoed that resolution, we repeat that call today. As President Biden conveyed to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu on April 4th, Israel must announce and implement a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by Israel's immediate action on these steps. Given the serious allegations regarding UNRWA personnel tied to Hamas, we fully support the ongoing investigations into the organization and look forward to the independent review conducted by former French Foreign Minister Colonna. At the same time, however, we note UNRWA's indispensable role in distributing humanitarian assistance in Gaza, especially given a looming famine. Onerous restrictions on UNRWA's work are unacceptable, especially given grave concerns about looming famine. Of course, even as we press Israel to do much more to protect humanitarian workers and facilitate the life-saving work of the UN, including UNRWA, we must not ignore how Hamas's actions have put humanitarian personnel at risk. Tunneling under and storing weapons in hospitals is a violation of the laws of war, and we condemn it. We also continue to do all we can to help deliver humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians in Gaza through all available means. But these actions are not enough to meet the needs of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Humanitarian assistance is desperately needed now, and it must be facilitated to mitigate the impact of an impending famine. Gaza's entire population knows acute levels of food insecurity. Gaza's entire population is in need of humanitarian assistance. That is why we continue to underscore an immediate ceasefire is essential to stabilize and improve the humanitarian situation and protect innocent lives. And we have urged Prime Minister Netanyahu to empower his negotiators to conclude a deal without delay to bring the hostages home. We urge Hamas as well to accept the deal on the table. We continue to support these negotiations and will continue to work to protect humanitarian staff and facilitate increased provision of humanitarian assistance into and throughout Gaza. And with that, I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States and pass the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, thank you for convening this meeting at the request of Algeria, joined by Guyana and Slovenia, to receive an update on the risk of famine and attacks against humanitarian workers in the occupied Palestinian territory, in particular the Gaza Strip. I thank Director Rajasingham and I thank Ms. Janti Sorepto for their important information and sobering briefing. A couple of days ago, in this chamber, we had a briefing during which we were presented with the devastating impact of the Gaza conflict on children. The report from Global Nutrition Cluster, referenced during that briefing, indicated that approximately 15% of children under 2 years of age in northern Gaza are acutely malnourished, and that the region is facing imminent famine. Several other open briefings have been held on the region since the start of the year. And in all of these meetings, we have been briefed about the unremitting Israeli bombardment of Gaza that has decimated almost all public and private infrastructure and has halted socio-economic activity in Gaza. Markets, private enterprises, and financial institutions, the bedrock of economic activity, are non-functioning in Gaza. Infrastructure for essential services like water, sanitation, energy, and health have been decimated. The global community is aware of the results of the 2-week military operation in the Al-Shifa hospital, which has left most of the hospital structure in ruins. The numbers regarding civilian casualties and internally displaced persons, with women and children being the most affected, are profound and must not be normalized. Despite the volatility in the region and the dangers they face, humanitarian workers have remained resolute in assisting civilians to access food and life-saving aid needed for their daily survival. We recall resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728, which demand parties to the conflict to comply with their obligations under international law, to protect civilians, and the need to allow for full, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access to all parts in the Gaza Strip. These resolutions of the Security Council are binding, and we are deeply concerned about the glaring non-compliance by the parties. We are also deeply concerned that civilians and humanitarian personnel are still being victims of strikes, often leading to their demise. The United Nations Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator for the Occupied Palestinian Territory has recently reported that at that stage in the conflict, at least 196 humanitarian personnel have been killed in the occupied Palestinian territory. The update from Director Raja Singham puts the tragic total at 226 humanitarian workers killed, 179 of which are UN personnel. Hundreds of humanitarian workers have paid the ultimate price, from the honorary Palestinian humanitarian workers to the World Central Kitchen workers. We offer our deepest condolences to their families and the organizations. Madam President, each day we're reminded of the risk of famine and the steep rise in malnutrition due to intense hostilities and restricted humanitarian access. OCHA has reported that at least 576,000 people in Gaza are one step away from famine and are facing catastrophic levels of deprivation and starvation. To minimize the impact of the dire humanitarian situation amidst these projections of food insecurity and famine, malnutrition, and disease, my delegation would like to emphasize the following. Firstly, Sierra Leone condemns all attacks against civilians and humanitarian personnel. They must stop, and effective deconfliction measures to deliver humanitarian aid implemented. Secondly, we continue to strongly urge the parties to the conflict to respect the resolution of this Council by implementing Resolution 2712, 2720, and 2728. Thirdly, we reaffirm the relevance and validity of the International Court of Justice provisional measures ordered of 26 January 2024 and the request for modification order made on 28 March 2024, which inter alia obligates the State of Israel to ensure without delay full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance, including food, water, electricity, fuel, shelter, clothing, hygiene and sanitation requirements throughout Gaza. Fourthly, Sierra Leone emphasizes the importance and imperative for accountability for the grave violations of international law by all responsible parties. As we call for peace, it must be accompanied by accountability to end impunity. Sierra Leone reiterates its position on the vital role of UNRWA amidst the myriad of factors impeding their humanitarian response. The need for their continued services cannot be overstated, as UNRWA remains the bedrock for the provision of life-saving humanitarian services to Palestinians across the Middle East region. Let me close, Madam President, by echoing the need for the intensification of political engagement, dialogue, to persistently pursue peace, premised on the two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone and pass the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, I wish to thank Malta's presidency for convening this urgent meeting on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. Our gratitude goes to Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham, Director of Coordination at OCHA, and Ms. Janti Sueripto, President and Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children US. Madam President, about 11 days ago, this Council overwhelmingly adopted Resolution 2728, tabled by the 10 elected members of this important organ. The purpose and object of that resolution was clear and unambiguous. A, to achieve an immediate and lasting ceasefire. B, to obtain the release of hostages. And C, to allow for the flow of humanitarian aid in larger quantities that could address the humanitarian tragedy presently unfolding in Gaza. We, members of the Security Council, adopted Resolution 2728 because of our unanimous stand that the death of children, women, and men in Gaza is unacceptable, and it defies our conscience, our humanity, and the principles and purposes enshrined in the United Nations Charter. The adoption of that resolution was a clear testament that no member of this Council could find it justified or justifiable the relentless military operation in Gaza, a military operation that is causing untold suffering of the Palestinian people. This is a critical situation that demands the immediate attention and concerted efforts of on our part in order to protect the people in Gaza. Madam President, of great concern to all of us is the fact that the ongoing military action appears to respect no laws of war, no rules of warfare, no boundaries of morality. The large number, more than 200 so far, of tragic deaths of humanitarian workers bears testimony to that assertion. The recent death of the World Central Kitchen workers in Gaza illustrates the dimension of the tragedy. The loss of these dedicated humanitarian workers is highly deplorable. These and other humanitarian workers who perished in Gaza were people solely devoted to providing essential aid to those in need. Their deaths constitutes a flagrant violation of the relevant provisions of international humanitarian law and of human rights law. We deeply regret the attack of Al-Shifa Hospital, which is in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention which underscores the critical importance of safeguarding civilian health units and maternity wards during armed conflicts. Madam President, we welcome the recent additional International Court of Justice order on the Gaza question. It mandates that Israel must take specific measures to address the crippling shortages of essential supplies in the war-ravaged Gaza Strip. This underscores the urgency of addressing the humanitarian crisis and ensuring that aid reaches those in need. In this regard, we urge Israel to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza by implementing measures to improve the situation. These measures include opening more land crossings to facilitate the entry of essential supplies such as food, water, and fuel into the war-affected Gaza. We urge member states to fully cooperate with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. The agency plays a vital role in providing humanitarian aid to the population in Palestine. UNRWA's assistance is essential to the well-being of civilians in that region. Madam President, as we labor for the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2728 and other resolutions of this organ, we should continue fighting for a peaceful and stable future in the Middle East that hinges on a vision of a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine living side by side as independent and sovereign states and coexisting as good neighbors as prescribed by the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique. I will now make a statement in my national capacity. I begin by thanking the briefers for their statements. We are deeply shocked by Israel's killing of 7 aid workers from World Central Kitchen in Gaza on 1st April. This brings the total number of humanitarians killed in this latest round of conflict in Gaza to more than 220, with 179 of these UN personnel. A number increasing day by day. We express our sincere condolences to the loved ones of all those UN and humanitarian personnel killed in Gaza. Malta calls for a thorough, independent, and urgent investigation into this completely unacceptable event and all previous ones. Accountability for any violations of international law, including international humanitarian law, must be ensured. Perpetrators must be held accountable. The latest attack once again underlines the urgent need for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We note that the movement of the humanitarian staff from World Central Kitchen was carried out in coordination with Israeli authorities, who were notified through the UN's humanitarian notification system. All procedures were followed, and yet this attack still happened. We stress once again that these systems are in place to ensure that these exact incidents do not take place. We recall the international humanitarian law obligations of all parties to protect humanitarian workers. Strikes on humanitarian workers are unacceptable, especially when these are providing much-needed humanitarian assistance to civilians in need. It is clear that more must be done to ensure full compliance with these obligations. On this occasion, I emphasize once again our firm conviction that UNRWA is a stabilizing force in Gaza and in the region, and there is no replacement to the services it provides. Member States must make sure that UNRWA can implement its operations in line with its mandate and that relief workers are protected. We call upon Member States to continue to contribute to the agency and ensure that it has the necessary resources to operate. We continue to observe obstacles being imposed by Israel, preventing the safe, rapid and unhindered facilitation of humanitarian assistance into and within Gaza. Since the outbreak of this conflict, Israel has obstructed a meaningful humanitarian aid scale-up in Gaza by placing onerous, arbitrary, bureaucratic and administrative impediments on aid delivery. Tent poles, chemotherapy drugs and basic commodities are being blocked from entering Gaza. Furthermore, it continues to block food from reaching Gazans who are in desperate need. According to the latest data, the entire population of the Gaza Strip is facing crisis levels of hunger. Around 500,000 people are on the verge of man-made and conflict-induced famine. More needs to be done. We cannot simply wait for a retrospective famine classification before ACT Central Kitchen has now been forced to suspend its operations and to return large consignments of undelivered food due to the fear of further attacks. Malta underlines that Resolution 2417 clearly states that the use of starvation as a weapon of war may constitute a war crime. We further stress that Israel must facilitate the use of all available routes and border crossings to and throughout the Gaza Strip. The announced opening of the Erez crossing and the Karim Sharam opening and the Ashdod port is a necessary and positive development. The full and rapid implementation of these measures is fundamental. We are also deeply shocked by images of the aftermath of the Israeli military siege on Al-Shifa Hospital. Any systematic targeting of civilians using hospitals and medical facilities or their improper use by the parties is in direct contravention of international humanitarian law and Resolution 2286. This resolution, as well as all other Security Council resolutions, must be respected and implemented. Finally, Malta reiterates its firm position that de-escalation and dialogue are the only ways to allow the necessary space to relaunch negotiations for a just, comprehensive and peaceful resolution of this conflict based on the two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders. I thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Madam President, just a few minutes ago, we bore witness to a cynical attempt and an inexcusable attempt at manipulation on the part of our U.S. colleagues. In his statement, the U.S. representative stressed the fact that the call to protect humanitarian aid workers was contained in a U.S. draft resolution that was vetoed by Russia and China. Having said that, he cunningly kept quiet about the fact that UN Security Council Resolution 2728 contains a similar demand by referring to the requirement to implement Resolution 2720 on this very issue. He also kept quiet about the fact that the draft resolution be vetoed, and rightly so. That draft resolution didn't contain a requirement or even a call for a ceasefire. Having said that, the U.S. representative de facto gave the green light to the Israeli Operation Rafah. Colleagues, we believe that such low standards is something that has no place in the diplomacy of the Security Council. Instead of these dirty tricks, our colleagues from the U.S.
would be better placed to focus on exerting pressure on Israel and also to end arms supplies to Israel, which are being used to kill Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. Thank you. I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, Council members, dear colleagues, we want to express our appreciation to Algeria, Guyana, and Slovenia for convening this important meeting today. And I want also to add to express our appreciation to the unanimous decision by the Arab group yesterday requesting through our representative, the Ambassador of Algeria, to ask for this meeting and the two other countries, Guyana and Slovenia, for joining in this endeavor. I want also to thank the two briefers from OCHA and Save the Children, Mr. Raja Singham and Madam Sorepto, for their briefings. Madam President, allow me to address you today not only in your capacity as diplomats representing your states, but as parents and grandparents, as daughters and sons, as members of families that you love and cherish. Last night, a Palestinian father sat powerless by the bedside of his 2-month-old baby, watching him die slowly of hunger, after searching for hours and days for baby formula in northern Gaza to no avail. A mother had to leave her children in their home for their safety while she went out to try and find flour. She heard a loud bombardment as she reached the street's corner, rushed back with no flour, only to find her home destroyed and her kids killed. We speak of this terrifying assault against life in Gaza in days and months, 180 days, 6 months. But parents calculate in hours, agonize in minutes and seconds, and they wonder, how much longer will they have to wait? How much longer can they preserve shreds of life before them too? They are torn apart. To how many children will they have to bid an eternal farewell? Or how many children will they leave behind if they are to perish? Israel has destroyed the homes, killed entire families, displaced the entire population, demolished the hospitals, and made every effort to ensure no help could reach our people. It is killing those who heal, those who rescue, those who provide aid and relief, those who feed, those who report. Being a Palestinian is enough to be killed. Trying to help Palestinians like this brave woman and their organization is enough to be killed. You saw it over 2 weeks in a Shifa hospital, where Israel summarily executed people, arrested and tortured them, including the wounded and the sick and medical personnel, without feeling the need to provide much explanation or any evidence. It then burned down the most important hospital in the entire Gaza Strip, continuing to bring the health system to its knees at the time it is most needed to save lives. We present our deepest condolences to the families of medical personnel, of rescue teams members, and of over 200 aid workers who have been killed, and express our admiration to all the humanitarians who are pursuing their sacred mission at the peril of their lives. They should not be abandoned, but rather supported and protected. The killing of the aid workers from the World Central Kitchen is not an isolated incident. It is confirmation of what you all knew for months now. Israel is targeting those that the laws of war were established to protect. Israel knew very well who it was targeting, hitting 3 cars in 3 locations, despite the fact that they were identifiable and had coordinated with Israel the delivery of aid. It says it suspected 1 person, so it killed many. Never mind distinction, precautions, proportionality, protected status, never mind human decency. It is unfortunate that it took the killing of foreign nationals for some to fully acknowledge the fate reserved to Palestinians for 180 days now. As the World Central Kitchen CEO eloquently said, and I quote, "This is not only an attack against WCK, this is an attack on humanitarian organizations showing up in the most dire of situations where food is being used as a weapon of war. This is unforgivable," end of quotation. It is even more unforgivable that Israel, as occupying power, is the one with responsibility in ensuring that the civilian population is not harmed or starved, and instead it is not only inflicting such harm and starvation, but also killing those trying to alleviate them. For Israel, the entire civilian population and anyone helping them and the entire civilian infrastructure are legitimate targets. It's enough to call them, quote unquote, collateral damage, express grief, and move on to committing the next crime. Israel baselessly argued that the problem was in the organization delivering life-saving humanitarian assistance, UNRWA, whose role is fundamental and who is doing heroic work on the ground. Now, even the NGOs who have worked in the worst possible circumstances around the world are saying they cannot operate in Gaza because of the environment created by Israel. Madam President, Israel, while killing with its bombs and bullets over 32,000 Palestinians and maiming over 72,000 Palestinians, have also made sure to create a man-made famine, the worst of its kind, affecting over 2 million people, besieged and starved with tons of assistance by a few kilometers away? Who can still speak of shared values with Israel that is committing such crimes without being devoured by shame? This council finally demanded an immediate ceasefire, leading to a lasting and sustainable ceasefire. Israel ignored this demand. Resolution 2728 must be implemented. It is the responsibility of this council and all states to ensure that it is upheld. The ICJ ordered Israel twice in the last 2 months to undertake measures to prevent the real and imminent threat of genocide, including to take all necessary and effective measures to ensure without delay, in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to Palestinians throughout Gaza. But Israel breached the order. The problem is not that the Council adopted resolutions or that the ICJ ordered provisional measures, or that humanity has elaborated the rules that led the UN bodies to adopt these positions and which should be observed. The problem is that Israel can violate these rules, demands, and orders in full impunity. No one should arm or shield those committing atrocities. No one, no country should arm or shield those committing atrocities. They must be held accountable, or these crimes will continue. Faced with such outrage for its attack on foreign nationals from the World Central Kitchen, Israel took its first measures, dismissing 2 senior officers and reprimanding 3 others. That is the punishment for the commission of war crimes? That is outrageous. And who will be held accountable for all the tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians killed? Is our lives not worthy of holding accountable those who murder us and kill us in large numbers? Madam President, history will remember that Israel continued to be present within these walls while trying to bring down the UN and the international law-based order this organization stands for, destroying and displacing an entire people and denying their right to existence and their state, unchecked and unhinged, while the state of Palestine committed to the rule of international law and to the just and lasting peace has yet to become a member of these United Nations. This is only one more injustice to which our people is being subjected to, one more contradiction between the clarity of the statements and the ambiguity of certain actions. There are no nuances, no ifs and buts, no justifications for what Israel is doing. None. Let me repeat. There are no nuances, no ifs and buts, no justification of what Israel is doing. None. And there is no justification for the continued denial of our right to self-determination and to freedom and dignity in our land. We knew, you all knew, what was coming 6 months ago. We knew, and you knew, Israel would resort to mass and indiscriminate killing, to total destruction and devastation, and that the famine was on the way. This genocide was announced by Israeli leaders. It was perpetrated in broad daylight. It was displayed on your own screens. It was discussed in your meetings. Many of you were mobilized to stop it, but there are still tools that were not used, not even considered. One day, as for other genocides, a lot will be said about these failures. But we cannot wait. Action is needed now, at every level, with every means possible. I call on you, individually and collectively, to do more now, to figure out a way to stop these massacres and this meditated killing of children and women and men. I call on you to bring immediate relief to desperate parents who have witnessed what no parent should endure, and children who have suffered what no children should suffer. For 260,000 minutes now, for 260,000 minutes now, our failures mean their death. That should be reason enough for us to do everything in our power to bring this tragedy to an end. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to begin by expressing Israel's sorrow over the tragic incident which claimed the lives of the World Central Kitchen employees in Gaza. We express our deepest condolences, and our hearts go out to the families, their countries, and the World Central Kitchen. This was a tragic mistake. Israel never targets civilians deliberately, never, let alone aid workers carrying out crucial work. Israel holds the critical support of aid workers in the highest regard, and we will continue to coordinate with them and secure them in their missions. This incident has been thoroughly investigated, and the findings show that this strike was carried out due to a misidentification at night during a war under very complex conditions. The incident was investigated by an independent expert body and was completed last night. The findings were presented both to Israeli leadership and WCK officials before being released to the public. As a result, 2 senior military officers have already been dismissed from their posts. Israel has coordinated aid distribution with international organizations thousands of times, I repeat, thousands of times since the start of this war. And there is no question that this event was not deliberate. The military's standard operating procedure was violated, but it was the result of a tragic mistake made due to Hamas's cynical modus operandi to exploit civilian infrastructure and vehicles. Israel will learn from this investigation and take every effort to ensure that such a tragedy is not repeated. Council members, Israel is in the midst of a defensive war fought in unprecedented conditions against an enemy that fights from underground tunnels and hospitals and deliberately uses civilians as human shields. We did not start this war, and we did not want this war. We were attacked, massacred, by ruthless terrorists that are committed to repeat the massacre. Hamas chose to fight from within civilian population centers in Gaza, and as heart-wrenching as it is, tragic mistakes can happen. Every country that fought a war in dense urban conditions understands this. Due to the complexity of the battlefield in Gaza, tragedies that took the lives of our own people have occurred. IDF soldiers, our soldiers, have fallen from friendly fire, and Israeli hostages, our hostages, have been mistakenly killed by our soldiers. These are all tragedies, but the reality is that the loss of innocent lives during a war is sometimes unavoidable, despite all the efforts that Israel goes above and beyond to take. This is why the world must not forget for one moment why this war began. Israel abides strictly by the laws of war, and the Israel Defense Forces have implemented more precautions to mitigate civilian harm than any other military in history. Israel dropped 7 million flyers warning civilians to evacuate. 13 million text messages have been sent. Military maps were even distributed outlining safe areas and evacuation routes. These measures are unprecedented, and I don't know of any other military that meets these standards. Our enemy, on the other hand, Hamas, cares nothing for the well-being of civilians and entrenches itself among civilian population, all in order to deliberately maximize the number of civilian fatalities in Gaza. This is their goal. Do you have anything to say about how Hamas turned Shifa Hospital into a terror base? Over the past weeks, hundreds of terrorists were neutralized and arrested, all inside a hospital. Does this council have anything to say about it? This is what Hamas is, an enemy that takes every effort to maximize civilian casualties. This is the script that they have written for you, so that you can pressure Israel into a ceasefire and save them. For Israel, every loss of life is a tragedy. Yet, for Hamas, the death of civilians is their strategy. We were the ones who were butchered, and we are now fighting to not be butchered again. If Hamas's terror capabilities are not obliterated, they will rearm, regroup, and recommit atrocities against Israelis until they annihilate us. That is exactly what they have been doing for the last 18 years, since we evacuated and disengaged from Gaza. Colleagues, no country wishes this war to end more than Israel. It is our children who are fighting in Gaza, making the ultimate sacrifice. But we have no other choice. The formula for an immediate ceasefire is clear. Hamas must turn themselves in and release all the hostages. If this is done, the war can end today. 182 days have passed, and this council still have not even condemned Hamas. Instead, you have demanded a ceasefire with no strings attached, a ceasefire that isn't conditioned on the return of the hostages. This is a free pass for barbarism and sadistic violence. Any ceasefire that ensures Hamas's survival is a green light for many more October 7th. You know that there can be no solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians in our region as long as Hamas continues to rule in Gaza. But some members here prefer to ignore Hamas's genocidal ambitions. It's in their charter, by the way. If this council showed Hamas that terror is not tolerated and increased the pressure on them by, for example, designated Hamas as a terror organization, this war could end faster. Council member, not only is Hamas responsible for every casualty in Gaza, they are also responsible for the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Israel facilitates the constant entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. 19,000 aid trucks have already entered Gaza since the start of the war, carrying over 350,000 tons of aid, including 250,000 tons of food. Field and floating hospitals have been established, and no limits are placed on the amount of aid that can enter Gaza. No limits. The only reasons that the aid does not always reach the civilian population is because Hamas loots it and the UN is incapable of handling the capacity of supplies being brought in. At any given moment, there are hundreds, yes, hundreds of trucks held up on the Gazan side of the Kerem Shalom crossing, waiting to be received and distributed by aid agencies. The UN agencies failed to establish an effective distribution mechanism, but rather than taking responsibility, they blame Israel. Nevertheless, despite the lies, Israel is committed to making every effort to facilitate aid. Yesterday, as was pointed out by the Madam President, Israel's Security Cabinet decided to ramp up the amount of aid entering Gaza. More ports and crossings are opening, and we are taking measures that no other country at war has ever taken. Colleagues, while the UN was quick to forget the horrors of October 7th and chooses to focus only on the situation in Gaza, as we speak here now, there are over 100,000 Israelis displaced from their homes for more than 6 months with their children. Over 12,000 rockets have been fired at Israel from Gaza, and more than 3,500 rockets and missiles have been fired at Israel from our northern border, from Lebanon. Millions of Israelis are running back and forth from bomb shelters almost every day. 134 families are still praying for the return of their loved ones held hostage by Hamas, and the entire country is mourning the victims of the Hamas's massacre. Millions of Israelis face constant Palestinian terror attacks, but sadly, this is a fact that the UN chooses to neglect. After all, Israeli suffering means almost nothing between these walls. In each council meeting, a flawed picture is painted. You focus on Israel, making demands and issuing condemnations against Israel, while ignoring the terrorists that planned and initiated this war. And what should be done to thwart their genocidal schemes? This is also the responsibility of this council, the lives of Israelis, not only the lives of Palestinians, the future of Israelis. The Palestinian representative here does not represent Hamas and has no influence over them. He speaks only in the name of the Palestinian Authority that pays terrorists and up until this day never condemned the massacre. And the Palestinian Authority, as you know, has no presence in Gaza. So, dear colleagues, what does the Council have to say about the murderous Hamas terrorists, about the continuous rocket fire on Israel, about the exploitation of civilian sites for terror, like hospitals, about the looting of humanitarian aid, about women, Israeli women that are being raped right now in captivity and children being tortured? What steps are you taking against Hamas? Just because a representative of Hamas is not sitting in this room, does that mean that you can ignore their atrocities and exploitation of Gazans as human shields? These discussions, sadly, are completely detached from reality, even though the truth is so clear. When will the UN finally hold Hamas accountable? The time has come to stop defending terrorists. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel and pass the floor to the representative of Saudi Arabia.
سعادة رئيسة مجلس الأمن السفيرة فانيسا
Your
فايزر
Excellency, Madam
أتشرف
President of the Security
بإلقاء هذا
Council, Ambassador
البيان نيابة
Vanessa
عن
Perez,
المجموعة
I have
العربية.
the pleasure and honor to give this
وأود في البداية أن
statement on behalf of the
أهنئكم
group of Arab
بتولي
states.
بلادكم
At
رئاسة
the outset, I
مجلس
would like
الأمن
to
لهذا
congratulate
الشهر
you on your assumption
متمنيا
of the
لكم
presidency of the
النجاح
Security Council
والتوفيق
this month, and I
في
wish
إدارة
you
أعمال المجلس.
success in your
كما أود أن
management
أتقدم
of the Council's
بالشكر
work.
لممثل أوتشا
I
السيد
also
رامش
express our
راجا
appreciation
سينغهام
to OCHA's
والسيدة
representative, Mr.
جانتي
Ramesh
سوربيتو
Rajasingham, and Madam
ممثلة
Janti
حماية الأطفال
Sorindo,
Save the Children على
the
الإحاطات
representative
التي
of Save the
قدموها
Children. We thank them for
حول
the
أزمة
briefings
المجاعة واستهداف
on
العاملين في
the
المجال
famine and
الإنساني
the
لكون
targeting
هذا
of
الموضوع
humanitarian workers,
يشكل
because this
تحديا
is
للمجتمع
a
الدولي
matter that
والبشرية
poses a
جمعاء.
great challenge to the international community
السيد
and
الرئيس،
humanity as a whole.
79 عاما مضت على تأسيس
79
هذه
years have
المنظمة
passed
العريقة
since the establishment
التي وجدت
of
لتعزيز
this
العمل
August
الدولي بين الدول
organization, which was
والمنظمات بما
established to
يخدم
enhance international work
الإنسانية
between
ويرقى
states and
بحياة
organizations in a
الشعوب.
manner that serves humanity
إلا أنه
and
حتى يومنا
lifts
هذا
the lives
ما
of
يزال
the peoples
ملايين
of
البشر
However,
يواجهون
and until
خطر
this very
الجوع
day, we note
ونقص
that
الغذاء
millions
حيث
of
تكشف
people
التقارير
are
الدولية
confronting the
المتلاحقة
specter
عن
of
ازدياد
hunger and
أعداد
malnutrition,
الجائعين
where
حول
repeated
العالم
international
سنويا
reports
والذي
indicate an
وصل
increased
إلى
number of hungry
أكثر
people around the
من
world
700 مليون
yearly, and
إنسان
this
حسب
number has
إحصاءات
exceeded
آخر
700
إحصاءات برنامج
million
الغذاء
persons
العالمي.
as the
وهو
recent
الأمر الذي يحتم
statistics
على
of the
الدول
WFP
والمنظمات
indicate. This
العمل
requires
بشكل
organizations
حثيث
and states
لتحقيق
to work
أهم أهداف
intensively
التنمية
to achieve one of the
المستدامة
most important
ألا وهو
targets of
القضاء
sustainable
التام
development,
على الجوع.
namely the elimination
ولعلي هنا
of
أجدها
hunger.
فرصة
And
سانحة
here it is an
لأتقدم
important
بالشكر
opportunity for me
والامتنان
to
للمنظمات
offer our
الإنسانية
appreciation
والإغاثية
to the
الدولية
international
على الأدوار
humanitarian and
والتضحيات
aid
المهمة التي
organizations
يقومون
for
بها
the
من
important work
أجل
and
إيصال
sacrifices that they
الاحتياجات
make to
الضرورية
deliver
للمستحقيها حول
urgent
العالم
need to
دون
those
النظر لأي
urgent aid to
اعتبارات
those who need it
دينية
throughout the world with
أو
no
إثنية أو
consideration
عرقية أو
to
سياسية.
religion, ethnicity, or race
السيد
or
الرئيس،
politics.
في الوقت الذي ينص فيه
Madam
القانون
President, while
الدولي
international
على
law
تقديم الدعم
stipulates
المادي
that
واللوجستي
material
للمنظمات
and
الإغاثية
logistic
والإنسانية
support
حول
to
العالم،
humanitarian and relief
فقد فجع
organizations throughout the
العالم
world
بأسره قبل
is
يومين في
required.
قطاع
The
غزة
entire
المحاصر
world was
بحادثة
shocked 2 days
ليست
ago in the
بمستغربة من
besieged Gaza
فاعلها،
Strip with an incident that
فقد
is not
استهدفت
new
آلة
to those
الحرب
who perpetrated.
الإسرائيلية قافلة
The
الإغاثة
Israeli
الإنسانية
war machine has
التابعة
targeted
لمنظمة
a humanitarian
المطبخ
aid
المركزي العالمي،
convoy belonging
وأسفر
to the
عن ذلك
World
الهجوم
Central Kitchen.
السافر
This blatant
مقتل
attack
عدة أشخاص من
led to the
جنسيات مختلفة
death of
لا ذنب لهم
persons of multiple
سوى أنهم
nationalities, whose
يقدمون
only
الغوث
crime
للشعب
was that
الفلسطيني
they were
المنكوب.
attempting to deliver
لا شك أن
aid
هذه
to
الحادثة
the
هي
Palestinian
دليل
people.
آخر
There is no doubt
يضاف
that
إلى
this
سجل
incident
الانتهاكات
is simply
التي
more evidence to
ترتكبها
be added to the
سلطة
record
الاحتلال
of the
الإسرائيلي
violations perpetrated by
ضد
the
العاملين في
Israeli
المجال الإغاثي،
occupying power
حيث
against
وصل أعداد
humanitarian aid
الضحايا
workers.
منهم إلى
The
أرقام
total
لا
number
يمكن
of victims among
سكوت
humanitarian
المجتمع
workers has
الدولي عليها،
reached a number that
بسابقة
we can
خطيرة
no longer remain silent over
تنتهك
as the
كافة
international
المواثيق
community. This is a dangerous
والقوانين والأعراف
precedent
الدولية.
that violates all international
وعليه فإن
rules
المجموعة
and
العربية
customs and
تدين
charters.
بأشد
Therefore, the group
العبارات
of Arab
هذه
states
الجرائم التي
condemns
ارتكبت
in the
بحق
strongest terms
موظفي
the crimes that were
منظمة
perpetrated against
المطبخ المركزي
the
العالمي
World Central
وغيرهم من
Kitchen's staff
العاملين في
and
المجال
other workers
الإغاثي
in
الذين
the delivery
بذلوا
of
أرواحهم في سبيل خدمة
relief and
أبرياء
aid, who have
يواجهون
sacrificed
خطر
their
الموت
lives to
من
serve
التجويع
innocents
الممنهج
that are confronting
الذي
the
وبكل
danger
أسف
of death because they are being
يستخدم
systematically
كسلاح في هذه
starved
الأزمة المشتعلة
and because
من خلال مواصلة
this
الاحتلال الإسرائيلي
starvation
غلق
and hunger
المعابر
is being used as a
ومنع
weapon in this
الغذاء
crisis
والماء
as the
والدواء
Israeli
والوقود
occupation continues to close crossings and to
واستهداف
prevent the entry
المدنيين
of food, water,
الفلسطينيين أثناء
medicine and
محاولتهم
fuel.
الحصول على
And it targets
المساعدات
Palestinian civilians
الغذائية
when they attempt
في
to
أكثر
reach
من مناسبة،
this food aid, and this has happened on more than one
مما أدى
occasion.
إلى تفاقم الوضع الكارثي الإنساني
All of these
الذي
events have
يشهده قطاع غزة
exacerbated
اليوم
the already
وذهب
catastrophic
ضحيته
humanitarian
عدد كبير
situation
من
in the Gaza
الفلسطينيين
Strip
لا سيما
and
الأطفال
has
والمرضى
caused
والنساء
a large
وهو
number
الأمر
of
الذي تديره
Palestinians,
المجموعة
especially
العربية
children
إذ
and
يمثل
those
جريمة
who are
حرب
infirm
بموجب
and
القانون
women to
الدولي
fall victim to it.
الإنساني
This is something
ويجب أن
that
يتحمل
that is condemned by the Arab
الإسرائيلي
group
كافة
as it is a war
المسؤولية
crime
حياله.
in the eyes of the international
السيد
humanitarian law,
الرئيس
and
السيدات
the Israeli
والسادة
occupation must
إن
be
هذه
held fully
المذبحة
responsible
تعد
for it.
وبلا شك
Madam
دليل
President, this massacre
إدانة
is
جديد
further damning
على الإبادة
evidence on
الجماعية
the genocide
التي
that
تنتهجها
the
حكومة الاحتلال
Israeli
الإسرائيلية
occupying government is pursuing in its military operations in Gaza. Therefore, the Arab group calls for an international investigation in this incident, which comes 6 months after the start of the Israeli aggression on the Gaza Strip, an aggression that has led to the martyrdom so far of over 33,000 Palestinians and has wounded over 75,000 others, most of whom are women and children. Moreover, this latest incident has taken place despite the continued international calls and the condemnation and the resolutions adopted by this Council calling for an immediate ceasefire and for the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people who are facing the danger of a real famine because of Israel's intransigence. The most recent of these Security Council decisions was Resolution 2728, adopted by this Council on the 25th of March, and which called for an immediate ceasefire during the holy month of Ramadan. The Arab group calls upon this Council to take resolution under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to secure that Israel, the occupying power, would abide by a ceasefire and to giving access to humanitarian aid and to putting an end to the evil aggression on the Palestinian people and providing protection for them. The Arab group stresses the need for this Council to undertake its mandated role to make the occupying state abide by relevant Security Council resolutions and to abide by international law and international humanitarian law. And the two orders issued by the ICJ recently in the case of the genocide that Israel is perpetrating against the Palestinian people.
وتؤكد المجموعة العربية بأنها ستواصل تحركاتها على كافة المستويات وفي كل المحافل الدولية لمساعدة مجلس الأمن على القيام بدوره الأساسي في حفظ الأمن والسلم الدوليين وضمان امتثال دولة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي بالتوقف الفوري والدائم لإطلاق النار والسماح بمرور المساعدات الإنسانية دون معوقات مع توفير الحماية الدولية اللازمة للشعب الفلسطيني وللعاملين في المجال الإنساني حتى يتمكنوا من أداء مهامهم النبيلة. السيد الرئيس تؤكد المجموعة العربية على دعمها لوكالة الأمم المتحدة لإغاثة وتشغيل اللاجئين الفلسطينيين الأنروا التي تقوم بدور لا يمكن الاستغناء عنه ولا استبداله كونها تمثل شريان الحياة لأكثر من مليوني فلسطيني يواجهون كارثة غير مسبوقة في غزة وتدين المجموعة العربية في هذا الصدد قتل جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي لأكثر من 176 موظفا من وكالة الأنروا منذ بداية العدوان الإسرائيلي على قطاع غزة. كما تثمن قرار مجموعة من الدول الصديقة استئناف دعم الوكالة والأثر الإيجابي لذلك على قدرة الوكالة على القيام بدورها في مواجهة الكارثة الإنسانية التي يسببها العدوان الإسرائيلي على قطاع غزة ومساعدة اللاجئين في مناطق عمل الوكالة الخمس. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
I thank the representative of Saudi Arabia and pass the floor to the representative of Australia.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to address you today. Australia is horrified by the trajectory of the conflict and catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. Throughout, Australia has called for restraint, the protection of civilians, and safe, unimpeded access for life-saving humanitarian assistance. Instead, more than 1 million Palestinians are on the brink of famine, and more than 30,000 civilians and 190 humanitarian workers have been killed. Among those aid workers are Australian Zomi Frankencom and her World Central Kitchen colleagues, killed while carrying out urgent and vital support to the people of Gaza. The death of any aid worker in such circumstances is outrageous, unacceptable, and creates further dangers for civilian populations. Wartime does not obviate responsibility for observing international law. We have made clear to the Netanyahu government that we expect a thorough, genuine and transparent investigation and full accountability. We call for all parties to the conflict to comply with Security Council Resolution 2728. We acknowledge the opening of additional border crossings by Israel. This must translate into massive and sustained increases in humanitarian aid reaching those in need. We repeat our demands for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire leading to a sustainable ceasefire. Hostages must be released, civilians must be protected, and aid must flow. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Australia and pass the floor to the representative of Poland.
Madam President, Poland follows with great concern the current devastating crisis in the Middle East. We know very well the consequences of war, invasion and terror, which are felt for generations. This day we have been profoundly shocked by deadly strike on World Central Kitchen convoy, which took lives of 7 aid workers. One of the fatal victims of the attack was a Polish citizen, Damian Sobul. Madam President, please allow me to say a few words about our citizen, Mr. Sobul. He was a volunteer with a long-standing commitment to humanitarian causes, who was involved in providing aid to people not only in Gaza, but also in the other parts of the world, including Turkey, Morocco, and Ukraine. Please allow me, Madam President, to convey from this chamber our deepest condolences to the family and friends of Mr. Sobul. We extend these condolences to the families and close ones of all other humanitarian workers who have lost their lives in this horrific event. May their souls rest in peace. The details of attack revealed by media are deeply disturbing. The strike happened along the road used to transit aid through Gaza, which was supposed to be a deconflicted area. In spite of the fact that the transport had been notified to the Israeli army, it was hit 3 times by the IDF. Madam President, on October the 7th, Poland was shocked by the Hamas brutal attacks. Polish authorities at all levels have condemned them in the strongest possible terms. Our position remains unchanged. We see the use of innocent civilians as human shields as particularly repulsive, and we constantly call for a release of all hostages without any preconditions. We constantly stress that Israel, just like any other state, has the right to defend itself. But we also stressed that the right of self-defense must be exercised in full compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law. Therefore, self-defense must not result in the suffering of the innocent civilians, nor in the death of those who come to help them. And this is why, since the very beginning of the escalation of the conflict after October the 7th, Poland reiterates that it is imperative to address humanitarian needs of civilian population suffering in Gaza. Madam President, for decades, Poland has been active in humanitarian and development aid projects in the Middle East, with particular focus on Palestine and Lebanon. But it is important to stress that humanitarian help cannot be provided without safe access and safe working conditions for the United Nations humanitarian agencies and international humanitarian organizations. Humanitarian workers must be protected at all times in line with international law. Meanwhile, the members of humanitarian organizations in Gaza are in constant danger and are not able to perform their work. Madam President, today we pay tribute to the heroism of Damian Sobul and his commitment to helping those suffering and those in need. We also pay tribute to all other employees and volunteers of humanitarian and aid missions who sacrificed their lives. International law must be upheld, and even in the times of conflict. Resolutions adopted by the Security Council regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza must be respected. There are common values and rules. In this vein, we call on Israel to conduct a swift, full and transparent investigation and hold those responsible fully to account. To conclude, Madam President, Poland reiterates its unwavering commitment to peace and stability in the Middle East. We are strongly in favor of a robust coordination of all efforts to restore calm in the region. Preventing regional spillover and restoring calm in the Middle East is now more urgent than ever before. We believe that the UN community should be able to develop a common position on this extremely important issue. Otherwise, the escalation and spreading of the conflict may have devastating and long-lasting consequences that we all would like to avert. And I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Poland. There are no more names inscribed in the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.